Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin day 4, Enlightenment and the Abolition. And Abolition. Our learning objective is explain how the Enlightenment affected societies over time. So we're going to do this through kind of looking at the abolition of the slave trade. All right. All right. So as we kind of transition to this topic. We're gonna be looking at chattel slavery and how it came to an end, and it'll come to an end in a couple of different ways. So, and you're probably more familiar with the story of the United States and how it comes to an end there. But we're going to look at that and as well as other ways in which it comes to an end. Just to kind of wrap up with what we had talked about yesterday, right? So yesterday we looked at this passage from Mary Wollstonecraft, and so we were looking at the Enlightenment and how, and I guess the general way to say it is how rights movements use the Enlightenment. So in this case here, we were looking at yesterday a passage from Mary Wollstonecraft from her Vindication of Rights of Women. So what is the main idea of this? That women should be educated the same as men. Not just women, right? Should be equal. And our Enlightenment ideal is the idea that women are rational creatures and gender equality. And how do you get to that idea? She attacks or she criticizes Rousseau. All right. So as we discussed in yesterday in the last video, when you're talking about these rights ideas and how the Enlightenment impacted them, in the case of women's rights movement, the well was dry when it comes to being able to borrow ideas or to utilize ideas from Enlightenment philosophers. So, in the case of Wollstonecraft, she has to attack ideas by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in this passage here. She will modify ideas of Locke. All right. So I guess the question that begins is, we see what women's rights movements had to do and suffrage rights movements had to do to try to use Enlightenment ideals. All right. How about abolition? All right. So I guess when you look at the topic of chattel slavery and how it is dealt with by Enlightenment thinkers, it's not like the women's rights movement, where you have kind of a universal, nothing that you could really use to support the idea of women's equality. You have kind of a mixed, kind of assortment of things. So, you take someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There's, similar to the women's rights movements, there's really nothing there with, that you can borrow from Jean-Jacques Rousseau regarding slavery. So his famous quote there about people being in chains is not about slavery, right? So if you look through the literature of Rousseau, he will justify slavery, borrowing the ideas from ancient Greece, right, and using their justification, right? So, but John Locke is not quite the same, right? So many people who will be advocating for the ending of chattel slavery or the abolishment of slavery, they will actually use John Locke, right? But they will not use early John Locke. So John Locke's a good example of kind of a complex, development on this topic of chattel slavery. So kind of earlier on in his life, he writes this piece called The Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. So he writes this in 1669, where he explicitly supports hereditary nobility, and he will also support slavery in this piece, right? Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over their slaves. Right, so he does write and advocate for slavery as well as hereditary nobility early on. You could also say that he supported slavery because he owned shares of the Royal African Company. Now, I guess that's a little bit less explicit than the earlier piece because he acquired that stock as like an in-kind payment, and he eventually, eventually sells it. Now, so this is kind of early on in his life, or earlier on in his life, but his position on chattel slavery evolves. All right, so let's kind of look at how it evolves. All right, so we have by 1689, when he's writing Two Treatises of Government, man is born free, and has been proved with a title of perfect freedom in an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the laws of nature, equally with any other man, hath by nature power to preserve his property, that is, life, liberty, and estate. Right? Thus, each person has the right to own persons and labor, a right that includes the ability to contract with someone else. That right is very different from slavery, right? Which is forced labor. All right, so you have in this statement here, although he's not explicitly saying, that he is, that he's referencing, chattel slavery at this point. So this one's a little less clear, but you could say that that he is talking about all men. All right. But that would be a slippery slope, and that's something that people could easily argue against. Citing later people who use Locke, like Jefferson, right? So, did that not all copy over? All right, 1 second. I thought I had copied more than just that. Let me hold on 1 second. Let me finish this up real quick. Let me pull some out, because I had some additional passages where he is more explicit in his discussion of this topic. It just did not carry over. All right, so here we go. All right, so we have here. All right. So this is from the first treatise, right? And it begins, slavery is so vile and miserable in a state of man that 'tis hardly to be conceived that anyone would support it. He attacked the principle of divine and hereditary power methodically. Why should the eldest son inherit all the power by primogeniture, even over his brother? He also compared the king's claims to power as also illegitimate claims of masters over their slaves. Neither had hereditary or rightful claims. The king might argue that he has a right to rule, descended from Adam, but neither he nor masters of slaves had power over others by such suspicious claims. So what we see here in the case of the abolition movement is different than what the women's rights movements or the suffrage movements enjoyed. Is you do have textual support from the Enlightenment that could be used to help advocate for abolition. So when we look at abolition, we're actually looking at something that is supported by some Enlightenment philosophers, but not all. And we're also kind of in a similar way to suffrage. You're talking about something that incrementally over time will eventually result in the abolition of chattel slavery completely. All right. So this is going to be an incremental thing. And the first major incremental step, is the abolition of the trade of chattel slavery. Right. So that is what this image here is looking at is the abolition in the trade. So with textual support from people like Locke, you're going to see some kind of major players work to abolish the slave trade initially, right? And even though some of these other countries are earlier, the ones that kind of know is England, right? England is a major kind of one to look at, because by the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, England was the dominant trader in enslaved Africans in the Atlantic system, right? Their joint stock companies were dominating that trade. So the abolishment in England will have impact. It's not just a symbolic impact. It'll have a significant impact. And of course, as the U.S. Constitution is getting ratified, one of the points that was a point of agreement between the different states as they were writing the Constitution and ratifying it was the abolishment of the trade of enslaved Africans into the United States after 1807. So that's kind of one of those 20 years out. The trade will end. So you do see the abolishment of the trade initially, right, and then and of course other countries are going to be very late to abolish the importation in, right? So Brazil is a very late one of these countries to abolish the trade. It won't be the last though, but it's the last in the Americas. All right. So so when we kind of look at this abolishment and how does it come about? Art is part of the abolishment of it, as is literature. But when you look at the story of England, it's done through Parliament. So in class we watch, and I'll put a link for this on my Google sites. So in class we watch this video called Amazing Grace, and it tells the story of John Newton, who was someone who had worked on slave boats and eventually becomes a preacher. Who writes a kind of a well-known sermon, and the lyrics of that sermon eventually become the lyrics of Amazing Grace. So we kind of talk about that, and we watch that, and that video references a movie that was made called Amazing Grace, and it was made around the time you were born. So I guess I would understand if many of you have not seen that film, right? But so in class we do watch. We kind of watch a trailer for this film. And in the trailer, it basically has three main people. You've got John Newton, you have William Wilberforce, who is image or pictured here. So Wilberforce is the member of Parliament who has a relationship with John Newton, and John Newton's feelings about the slave trade will be kind of channeled through William Wilberforce. So he becomes that member of Parliament who initially champions the abolition movement in Parliament. And of course, he, a third character gets really kind of developed in this piece. I'm trying to find a picture of him so I can show you. And that is not him. It's here, William Pitt. So Pitt becomes, eventually will become the prime minister. So Wilberforce and Pitt have a relationship from their school years, and so a lot of the movie is about this relationship between Newton and Wilberforce, and then of course Wilberforce trying to convince others, right? Trying to convince others, and especially Pitt. Pitt wants to support him, but Pitt is a politician. And needs compelling arguments to be made here, and of course what is really at issue here is, this is obviously an ethical and moral issue, but what they have to combat is the economics behind this. These member of Parliament's own shares in these joint stock companies. So abolishing the slave trade is really a story of getting Parliament to legally change the law that will hurt them financially. So what are the ethical and moral ways in which you have to make that argument in order to get people to vote against their own pocket, right? In the case of England. So it's it's an interesting movie, right? It's a very well done movie. All right. So so we watch that and we talk about that, and so kind of wrap up with the so through parliamentary means, the slave trade in England will be abolished in 1807, but that does not abolish slavery itself in the British colonies. So the British colonies itself will abolish slavery in 1833. So that means that colonies like Jamaica, right, will maintain the institution of slavery, chattel slavery, up until 1833. And I always kind of found this kind of interesting little give and take here. So this was published not that long ago. The British government put out this this little presser that says in 1833 the British government used 20 million pounds, 40% of its national budget, to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The amount of money borrowed for the Slavery Abolition Act was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that living British citizens helped pay to end the slave trade. So this is put up by Her Majesty's Treasury. Right, so just thinking about this, where's that money going? Like, what does this mean by the freedom? Who is being paid for this? And of course, the Guardian, kind of very quickly pointed out exactly who was getting paid for this. So so this is from the Guardian. Keenan Malik. The government certainly shelled out 20 million pounds or 16 billion pounds in today's dollars in 1833, not to free slaves, but to line the pocket of 46,000 British slave owners as recompense for losing their, quote, property, unquote. Having grown rich on the profits of an obscene trade, slave owners grew richer still from its Indian. Right? So, and of course, this is the story that we will see in a lot of different places that use legal means to end slavery. You will see compensation paid to plantation owners, and even in places where that will win their own freedom, you will see this kind of policy in place. I guess most famously is in Haiti, right? So Haiti will win its independence in 1804, and then what immediately happens after is embargoes are enforced against trade again from Haiti, really until the French come to an agreement, which takes about 20 years after the Haitian Revolution. So the agreement that France comes to with Haiti is Haiti will pay the French landowners and plantation owners for their loss of, quote, property, unquote, right? And so this means in order for Haiti to be recognized, that they need to put themselves into debt to pay back plantation owners. Then that debt will be carried by Haiti until after World War II. So kind of deep into the 20th century, right? So abolitionist slavery, right? England will be the first kind of major power to ban the slave trade. Then in 1833, in their colonies, and then other countries will come about it in different ways, right? So the United States, you will see opposition morally, and economically, made by abolitionists in northern states, but it will take a war to end. Which means when you look at how slavery came to an end in the United States, you will have northern abolitionists making these kinds of claims, and of course you will have resistance in southern states by slaves themselves. And of course, resistance takes many forms. This is an image demonstrating resistance via running away from slavery, but you also see armed resistance as well, right? And of course, locally, as we've discussed recently, Ibo's landing is an example of resistance. But here with the German Coast Uprising, we have an example of an armed resistance, right? Armed resistance. And of course, we show this in class. There's all kinds of examples of rebellion and resistance against slavery before the Civil War. So in class, we've already looked at the Stonewall Rebellion. We did that at the end of last unit, but also the New York City Conspiracy, Gabriel's Conspiracy, the German Coast Uprising, which is what that previous slide was about. And of course, probably the most well-known one that you probably cover in 8th grade is Nat Turner's Rebellion, right? So resistance to slavery takes many forms. Right, so it's always good to know at least one or two as a case study, so that you can use that as evidence if it does come up as as an SAQ, right, or as an LAQ, right? So make sure you know one. So we have talked about Stoner Rebellion. If you are not in that Stoner Rebellion group, then maybe you want to just take a moment and kind of run through this German Coast Uprising as another good example. All right. Kind of to transition here, let's just kind of look at the effects of this. So I guess we're not really transitioning, we're just looking at kind of the other side of this scale. So if we were looking at the causes of abolition, what are the effects of abolition? So let's use this. Let's look at this data set here. What are the effects of the abolishment of the chattel slavery, right? Of the institution of slavery in Caribbean colonies, right? And then, of course, let's break this down to short-term effects versus long-term effects. So take a few minutes and have a look at that. All right, so what are we seeing here? So in the short term, many colonies are negatively impacted by the abolishment of slavery, although not all are. So what are some reasons why some of these states may not have, right? So, because of the dates we're looking at, maybe not all of these were British, right? So different European colonies will ban slavery at different times. So some of these are not going to be British, but ones that are British are definitely going to be hurt in the short term. Well, how about long term, right? How about long term? Do they recover? The answer is yes. Most of them will recover. So how do you recover in the long term, right? Kind of within a generation, how do you recover from the ending of chattel slavery? So this is kind of, right, what does this transition into? So this transitions into, right, there you go, indentured laborers. So what we have here is a change in coerced labor systems, right? So a change in coerced labor systems. So in the Caribbean, we are seeing a transition from chattel slavery to indentured laborers. So then the next question is, where are these indentured laborers coming from? All right, so part of this concept of indentured means you put yourself into debt to move to the location. So where are they getting indentured laborers from? All right. So if you don't know, maybe you can use this image, right? So this is made from a French source, and this is looking at immigration patterns in 1858. All right, so kind of after the end of slavery in some parts of the Americas. All right, so where is the labor for sugarcane plantations? Where is it coming from? In the Caribbean specifically, right? In the Caribbean specifically. So hopefully you can read that and you can figure out that the indentured servants are coming from China, right? Coming from China and coming from, right, Bangladesh, India, right, South Asia, right? They're coming from South Asia, right? But you also have some coming from, this is, obviously Brazil still has legal importation of slavery at this point, as do some of the other Caribbean islands. So some are still coming in from Africa. So what had happened because of the banning of the slave trade in the Atlantic? Of enslaved Africans, what happens to those who were selling slaves, right? Obviously, some are still coming into the Americas, but you can see a massive diversion into the Indian Ocean world. So the Indian Ocean slave trade, which was up and running for 700 to 800 years before the Atlantic slave system, will persist for an additional, I guess depending on where you are, 100+ years after the Atlantic slave trade gets shut down. So what we're seeing here also is, they basically fall off the record keeping abilities of Europeans, right? So once they get into that kind of Zanzibar Omani trade network, they disappear. So where are they going? Largely into Dar al-Islam, right? So the last Islamic kind of Middle Eastern country to ban slavery would be modern day Iran. I think it was 1927. It was abolished in their constitution, right? So Iran were the Qajars at that point in history, right? Was still becomes a major importer. Right? So Dar al-Islam. you will see a major market. So that's kind of why you see those kinds of numbers. All right. So that's that's your indentured servants, where they're coming from. So here we have an image of sugarcane plantation indentured servants from India, here in Trinidad. All right. So indentured servants. In the United States, right? What replaces chattel slavery following the U.S. Civil War? Convict labor, right? So it is one of those. Basically, two primary replacements for chattel slavery in the United States. So convict labor is one, and of course here locally we have kind of a really well-known example of something that was created by convict labor. If you've ever been on a tour in the canals of the Okefenokee Swamp, those of course were dug by convict labor for the lumber industry there, right? And of course the other kind of replacement for chattel slavery in the United States was tenant farming, right? So we have a change in coerced labor systems, right, taking place. So it's always important in this class to track these coerced labor systems, and then be able to identify when these changes in coerced labor systems happen. All right. As far as slavery globally, what is the last country to abolish slavery? Mauritania in 1981 is, to the best of my knowledge, the last kind of recognized country to ban or abolish slavery. However, they don't make it a crime until 2007, right? And so if you don't know where Mauritania is, all you Model UN students are definitely going to know this. But if you're not, then you might not know where that is. So and of course, what we see in Mauritania is a slave caste. Okay, so does slavery still exist in Mauritania today? Question mark. Okay, and and I guess this depends on your source. So many will argue that slavery still exists all over the world today, including the United States. So, and in class we do talk about some examples in of how this appears or pops up in the United States, and of course how they get into the United States from foreign places. And it may not be in forms that you would even kind of think about or even imagine. One of the kind of examples I sometimes use in class is the example of a form of slavery that was uncovered by Real Sports, which is an HBO program called Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, and they uncovered an example of a modern day kind of slavery practice, where children were being taken from South Asia, places like Bangladesh, and brought into the Middle East for sporting reasons, right? For sporting practice reasons. So that was about 20 years ago. That story broke on Real Sports. So these are things that you may not even kind of think about that that could even be possible. But slavery is definitely something that is not 100% eradicated on planet Earth, and and it exists for various reasons, right? So modern slavery exists for debt bondage, forced marriage, child labor, human trafficking. A lot of that we see in the United States today, right? And forced labor. So this is this kind of one of those topics that it's good to be aware of, right? And and of course, make sure you don't, it's good to be aware so that you don't support these kinds of realities around the world. All right, so key takeaways from today. What is the Enlightenment? Let's kind of reminder what the Enlightenment is, and kind of look at all the different kind of angles. Make sure you know your philosophers, and what they had to say, what their big ideas were. And of course, major effects. We have new political vocabulary, right, of individual rights. It's going to have direct connections to the Atlantic revolutions, and of course, your rights movements are going to either use them directly refute them in some cases, and adapt them, right, for their own needs. All right, so the Enlightenment will lead to the revolutions. And of course, this is then going to lead to things like nationalism, which we will deal with after we get back from break. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.